Part 1, The End of the Vietnam War. In the lead up to the fall of Saigon, there was a sense of desperation among South Vietnamese forces and civilians. The US had already withdrawn its ground troops, leaving the South Vietnamese army to fend for itself against the advancing North Vietnamese forces. The Communist forces had already captured several key cities, including Hue and Da Nang, and were closing in on Saigon. As the North Vietnamese approached the city, the US scrambled to evacuate its remaining personnel and as many South Vietnamese civilians as possible. Helicopters were flown in to evacuate people from the US embassy, but chaos and panic ensued as people fought to get aboard. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese forces were closing in on the city, and it was clear that the end was near. The streets were filled with abandoned vehicles and people fleeing the city. As the North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the city, there was widespread looting and chaos. Finally, on April 30th, the North Vietnamese forces captured the presidential palace in Saigon, officially ending the war. South Vietnam had fallen, and the country was now under communist rule. The victory of the North Vietnamese forces was a major turning point in the Cold War and had far-reaching consequences for US foreign policy in the region. Part 2, The Post-War Period. The post-war period in Vietnam was also marked by ongoing tensions and conflicts with neighboring countries, particularly China. In 1979, China invaded Vietnam in response to Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, which had been ruled by a Chinese-backed government. The short-lived border war resulted in thousands of deaths on both sides and strained relations between the two countries for years to come. In addition to external challenges, Vietnam also faced internal divisions and conflicts. The government's policies of land reform and collectivization in the 1980s led to widespread protests and resistance from farmers and rural communities. These policies were eventually scaled back, but the government's handling of the protests and its continued suppression of political opposition further eroded public trust in the regime. Despite these challenges, Vietnam has continued to make progress in its economic development and integration into the global community. The country joined the World Trade Organization in 2007 and has become a major exporter of goods such as textiles, electronics, and seafood. The government has also launched ambitious infrastructure projects, such as the construction of a high-speed railway and the expansion of major ports. However, the legacy of the Vietnam War and the country's socialist political system continue to shape Vietnam's place in the world. The government's control over the media and limitations on free speech and association have been criticized by international human rights organizations, while some argue that the country's economic success has come at the cost of environmental degradation and exploitation of workers. Part 3, Vietnam Today. Vietnam's geopolitical position remains complex, as it seeks to balance its relations with neighboring countries like China and regional powers like the United States. The country has been a key player in the negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a trade agreement that includes several Asia-Pacific countries and the United States. However, the future of the TPP remains uncertain following the withdrawal of the US under the Trump administration. In recent years, Vietnam has also been actively engaged in the international community's efforts to address global challenges, including climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. The country has made significant progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing its use of renewable energy, and it has been praised for its handling of the pandemic, with relatively low numbers of cases and deaths. Overall, Vietnam's future remains uncertain, but its people and government have shown resilience and determination in the face of past and present challenges. As the country continues to develop and navigate its place in the global community, it will need to balance the demands of economic growth with the need to protect its citizens and environment, and to ensure that political freedoms and human rights are respected and upheld.